Hey, Mike with Nerd Problems Gaming here, the channel where we go through the good and bad of everything nerdy to make sure you spend your time on the best of the best. In today's video, I'll be doing a review and how to play of Kingdom Hearts Talisman, so let's get into it. So this game is kind of like Monopoly meets a dungeon crawler with a Kingdom Heart theme on top of it. But let's jump into how to play the game first so you have a better understanding of the game, and then we'll jump into my review after that. So now that we've got all the components out, the first step is setting up the game. And so you initially want to simply lay out the board on the table. The next step that you want to do is to take the adventure cards, this blue one here, and shuffle those. You also want to lay out the adventure tokens next to the cards so you have easy access to those. You also want to shuffle the spell cards on the table. You can also lay out the Keyblade cards, which are the red ones here. And then you want to set up the shop. And so this is very simple. The shop cards will have the green background on them. And then you just put them with their corresponding picture. It's pretty simple. You want to lay out the fate tokens, the money tokens, and you have the dice as well. You can also have the Keyblade cards face up if you choose to, as they're all virtually the same. They just look a little bit different. The next step is you want to have one player take all the character cards, shuffle them, and then each player can randomly choose one to start the game. Or if all players agree, you can pick your initial starting character card as well if you want to play like that. Once each player has chosen their specific character, you then can discard the remaining character cards and set them aside outside of the game. You'll only need these in the future if one of the characters happens to be defeated. At that point, the person would simply draw a new character and then begin the startup process again with that character. So in this case, we'll say one character drew Goofy and another character drew Donald. At this point, you'll take the starting dials that record your strength, magic, and health and set them to the initial starting amounts on the character. So for Donald, he has 3 strength, 4 magic, and 4 health. Goofy has 2 strength, 3 magic, and 4 health. You also will take fate tokens equivalent to what is listed on the card. So Donald has 3 fate, and Goofy also has 3 fate. Each character also starts with 1 money to begin the game. Also, be sure to read the details of your character's card, as sometimes they have special abilities which might activate at this point, having them start with a spell card, for example, and then you would just simply have them start with this. Spell cards you want to keep private and not let the other players know what you have. Also, each character will have a starting point of where they start on the board. So both Goofy and Donald in this case start in Disney Castle. So I can simply place both of them here on the starting point of Disney Castle. Some characters may also start with a green object card. So if they do, just simply again look at their special abilities and see if they happen to start with an object, and you can give them that at this point. So for example, Goofy has the special ability of, if Donald Duck is in play, add 1 to your magic. So I'll simply dial up my magic to 1, higher than it started with. You'll also want to keep Heartless cards handy, as you may need them as you play the game if your character happens to be transformed into a Heartless. But you can set them off to the side for now. When determining who goes first, it's the player that most recently played Kingdom Hearts, or you can simply randomize this by rolling for a high die if you choose to. So the object of the game is to score the most victory points and have the character get to the Door of Darkness and seal that. And you get additional points when you do that. So you want to beat the other players there as quickly as possible. And as you play, you're going to move along the different sections of the board. So there's an outer section, a middle section, and an inner section. And only certain locations can you move from an outer section to an inner section, and vice versa. And so you can do this through various corridors of darkness or gummy paths if you happen to have a gummy ship item. So to start, when it comes to a player's turn, the first step is movement. And that is just simply determined by rolling a die. Now, it will start with Goofy here, for example. He can now move 6 spaces in either direction. You can't double back during a turn, but each movement you can choose what direction you want to decide to go. So I could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's go to the Mystical House as the option. And once the character has finished the movement, you will now do encounters on that space. So in this case, it has a die symbol. So I will roll the die to take that action. So this is a 1. And then I can simply read on the board and see what happens when a 1 is rolled. So in this case, 1 through 3, nobody is home, and that is Goofy's turn. Now I would shift to the other player in clockwise fashion. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Donald, I'm going to go to the gummy path. And now you do what's on the space, and that is drawing an adventure card. And so now I drew an armor card, and so Donald simply gets that. And now it will go to Goofy's turn again. So anytime you land on a space that requires you to draw a blue adventure card, typically they have an order in which the card is resolved. And usually it starts with combat with enemies, resolving any additional instructions, visiting strangers and places, collecting any followers, money, and objects, surrendering any followers, money, and objects. Or if you have to decide what order they go in, you can simply look at the bottom left corner is a number. So in this case, it's 5. And you simply start with the lower number and work your way up. Also note that if instructions on the card cause it to be placed other than the space the character is on, it does not affect the character who drew it at that time. Sometimes a card will fit on the actual space. Other times it will not. And so if it does not fit, this is where the adventure card tokens come into play. And so you can simply place a token on the space where the card was drawn, and then you would place it on the card. This designates that when you land on that space, you need to resolve some sort of action with that marker. If you did not like the roll that you got, whether it be from combat or some other action on the board, you can spend 1 fate token to re-roll that roll to attempt to get a better roll. Now you can only roll 1 die with a fate token, and you may only re-roll this die 1 time. So you cannot spend multiple fate tokens to re-roll the same die over and over again. But occasionally you might roll 2 die at the same time, such as an Agrabah. And so if you wanted, you could spend a fate token for each die that you rolled in this instance to attempt to re-roll it. Occasionally you may also draw a Heartless card or an enemy combatant. So what happens in this instance, you will roll first for your character. You may also use any spells at this time prior to your roll. So in this case, let's say Donald encountered this Dark Ball Heartless. So Donald would roll. He got a 5. And as you can see, it has a strength icon. So now the other player would roll for the monster. So the monster only got a 2 in this case. So you would take 2 plus the 2 on the card, meaning 4. And Donald rolled a 5, and you would add a 5 to Donald's strength of 3, making 8. So in this case, 8 was more than 4. And so now Donald would acquire this Heartless card as a trophy. What's cool is that once your trophy total reaches an increment of 5, so 5, 10, 15, whatever the case might be, you can turn those cards in and increase, in this case, your strength by 1 point. And you just simply turn that up to increase that. There's also enemy encounters that have a magic symbol. You would follow this same process. You would simply use the numbers associated with your magic dial to see if you were victorious or not. If you end in a tie with the monster, you don't receive any damage, but you also don't defeat the monster. And in that case, it would still be on that location. So you'd simply just use an adventure card token on the space to designate that that monster and Heartless are still there, and your turn would be over. If the monster happens to defeat you and has a higher total number than your character, you end up losing 1 health. So you simply notch that down 1 space. Also, in the rare circumstance that 2 players might be on the same space while encountering a monster, they can ask another player for aid or help in that battle. In this instance, when a player helps the other, you will simply add up to 3 strength or magic to the attacking character's score, but it only can go up to what the assisting character actually has. So in this case, Goofy's strength right now is only 2, so he cannot add more than 2 strength if he were to assist Donald in this battle. But if it happened to be a magic battle, Goofy has a magic of 4, so he could add up to 3 points of assistance. If a player agrees to aid in combat and the combat results in the enemy being defeated, characters that assist in the combat gain 1 money. If this initial attacking character is defeated, the assisting character also loses 1 health. They can, however, use objects that they might have equipped to prevent that damage. Certain cards also can give you the ability to evade attacks in specific locations and from specific monsters. So if you happen to have a card that does that, just simply read the card and see the rules associated with that. As I mentioned, as you play, you can acquire objects. Your maximum holding capacity for objects is 4 cards. Some items, however, do give you the ability to increase the number of objects you can hold. When it comes to attacking, there are different types of objects. There's armor objects as well as weapon objects, and you can only equip and use 1 of those per combat, unless their special abilities state otherwise. Throughout the game, you'll also acquire followers through the adventure deck, and a character can have as many followers as they want. So just simply continue to add them to your character card area as long as other cards don't prevent adding additional followers. You also may surrender followers and objects at the end of your turn by leaving them face up in a space they occupy. So for example, Goofy happened to be here. I could simply leave that follower in that location and move on. Another player would then pick that card up once they land on that space. Now, when it comes to spells, characters can only equip so many spells based on their overall magical abilities. So looking at this, when it comes to how much total magic you have, if you have 1 magic, you can carry 0 spells. If you have 2, you can carry 0. If you have 3 points, you can carry up to 1 spell. 4 points up to 2, 5 points up to 2, and 6 points up to 3 spells at a time. If you happen to have more spells than the magic allows, the player can choose which card to discard. The only other way to get rid of a spell is to use it. A character may use any number of spells from their hand on their turn, but they only can use 1 spell during another player's turn. Spells are always resolved immediately when a player chooses to use them, and they are immediately discarded. Now, some situations on the board will happen to turn your character into a Heartless, and typically that happens for 3 turns. When this happens, you leave all of your items, money, and followers on the space where you turned into a Heartless. Also, your strength now becomes 1, your magic now becomes 1, and you can only move 1 space per turn. You may not add any additional strength or magic cards to your character or cast any spell cards that you have. When you return to normal, your character will be as before as you are turned into a Heartless. If your character happens to get defeated and your health points go to 0, that character is now defeated. You will discard them and draw a new card and follow the initial setup process of setting their initial strength, magic, and health, fate tokens, any abilities that they have, and that character also goes to the starting location of the new character. So this can set you back quite a bit if you do happen to become defeated. You do, however, keep your items and money and followers that you had previously to being defeated. Using cards is always optional. Characters may hold cards they're not permitted to use or hold multiple copies of the same card unless a given card or ability specifically states otherwise. Keyblade cards and item cards from the shop, when discarded, actually are just simply returned back to their respective piles, so other characters may use them again. When it comes to crossing into another section, there are certain ways to do it. On this board, you can do it through the Battle of 1,000 Heartless, and you can do that by fighting a Heartless with a 9 strength ability. If you do happen to win, you can then cross into the middle area. Other areas that you can use are the Corridor of Darkness. To activate this, a player must start their turn here, sacrifice 1 heart, and then move into the middle section. You can also cross from the outer section to the middle section through a gummy path. However, in order to do this, you must have acquired a gummy ship. To acquire a gummy ship, you can first buy a dream rod or acquire a dream rod through the store or through drawing one through an adventure card. Then on a turn where you happen to be in a gummy path, you can exchange it for a gummy ship. And then that next turn, you can move to the middle row, or if you happen to be on a middle row gummy path, you can move to an outside row as well using that gummy ship. You cannot, however, move to the inner row. The only way you can move in this case from the middle row to the inner row is through the Gate to the Dark. One key difference of once you enter the inside row is that you now can only move 1 space at a time versus rolling a die. Some cards do allow you to move more than 1 space, but if you don't have those cards, you can only move 1 space at a time in this area. One key thing to note is that in order to close the Door of Darkness and get into this space, you need to have a Keyblade for your character. In order to get a Keyblade, you must land on the Keyblade graveyard and accept a quest. You do this by rolling a die and seeing which quests you now have as a character. So in this case, Goofy would need to discard 1 magical object. Once that task and quest has been completed, you are able to draw a Keyblade card and have that on your character. Now, when you get to the final rest, you're able to open the Door to Darkness and end the game. You can only have 1 quest at a time, and once you accept a quest, you are stuck with that quest. Once the Door to Darkness has been reached, the game ends, and you now calculate victory points to see who won. You gain victory points as followed. If a character ends the game in the outer region, they gain 0 points. If they're in the middle region, they gain 1. If they're in the inner region, they gain 3. If they have reached the Door to Darkness, they gain 5. Also, the person that reaches the Door to Darkness first will roll a die to see how many additional victory points they get, in this case 5. Then you go through and add up each item, follower, spell, and magical object. You get 1 victory point for each one of those. You also get a victory point for every 2 money that you have. From there, you'll also subtract your starting abilities, so your starting strength and starting magic. You will add those together and subtract that from your current strength and magic. And for each leftover point, you'll gain a point in that manner as well. You now add up your final score, and the player with the most points wins. These rules are further broken down in the rule book, so be sure to check that out for any specifications on rules, and also just simply read the space on the location to see if there's any additional rules that activate when you land on a space. Also, definitely feel free to comment below if you have questions on rules as well. But now that you have a better understanding of how the game works, let's jump into the review and how I feel about the game. So now that you guys have seen how the game is actually played, how do I feel about it? Well, if you've watched the part on how to play the game already, you might think that the game looks pretty difficult, but in actuality, it's really simple. Most of the rules are just right on the game board when you land on a space. When you draw cards from the adventure deck, they pretty much just tell you exactly what to do. On the item cards, it lists out everything that you need to do. So I think the rules are explained really well, and a lot of them, it's more just encountering what to do when you actually encounter that specific aspect of the game. So it's actually pretty simple to learn, even if it seems like there's a lot going on at once. Another thing I think the game does really well is it really captures the theme of Kingdom Hearts. So I don't know if just Talisman itself happens to fit kind of well for the theme of Kingdom Hearts, but the characters in the game are done incredibly well. There's great miniatures with the game. All the components are very Kingdom Hearts themed. You've got different followers of the various characters that you meet throughout the games. It has that RPG element where you're leveling up characters and fighting enemies. You're getting items, making your characters more powerful, traveling to various worlds across the game board. And so I really felt like I was playing a Kingdom Hearts game in this game. So they did a really great job on that. One downside with the game is I did feel like a couple of the characters were very overpowered, or I guess maybe on the other end of the spectrum, a couple of the characters were pretty weak and hard to play as. And it felt like depending on who you were facing and who your opponent had as a character, it might be extremely easy for them compared to you, depending on the character that you drew. But most of them are well balanced. There's just a couple outliers that I felt were a little off balance in the game. Now, as you play the game, there is definitely some strategic elements based on where you want to go and where you move your character, but there's also a high degree of randomness as well in the game. That's why I originally said it was a little bit like Dungeon Crawler meets Monopoly, where there is that random factor with a lot of how the cards come up and what happens when you land on specific spaces. You might get great items that you draw from the deck, making your playthrough really easy. Other times it could be very hard depending on what cards came up. Another thing I wish they would have done in the game is giving the Keyblades that you collect some type of extra bonus or stat boost. As you play the video game Kingdom Hearts, each Keyblade kind of had its own unique abilities, strengths, and weaknesses to them. And in this game, you get the Keyblades, and that just allows you to get into the final area and seal off the Door of Darkness. I think it would have been cool if the Keyblade had some extra bonus abilities to go along with it. But it doesn't really negatively impact the game. Just something that I wish was included in it as well. Another thing that I noticed is that the spells seemed very difficult to actually get, where played through maybe 5 or 6 times with the game with various different people, and we really only got a handful of spells between all of us playing over all of the playthroughs. So it seemed like they were cool and a nice addition to the game, but it was very hard to actually get them and use them. So I wish it maybe was a little bit more frequent where you could get spells in the game. That might make things a little bit more interesting. Also on the game board, there's a couple spaces that seemed almost irrelevant, where they were extremely challenging to go through, and for the most part, we always just found ourselves ignoring those spaces or taking other routes. So it almost seemed like, why are these spaces even in them? Or maybe they need to be retooled a little bit so they weren't as difficult. Especially in the most inner circle of the game, there was a couple where it was almost a no-brainer, where you only went one direction every time, and it wouldn't really make sense to go the other direction unless in some extreme scenario that required you to. Also, I don't know necessarily how the traditional Talisman game plays, but it kind of felt like it was more you versus the game compared to being you versus the other players. So this is a competitive game, but for the most part, there was very little interaction between characters or sabotaging characters, or even with the ability to help other characters out. I didn't necessarily find any of us doing that in all the playthroughs that we did. Which again isn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just kind of an observation as we played the game. We really found it was just more you against the game compared to you versus the other players. Also, when I played, most of the time it was in the 2-player version, and there are a lot of cards in the game that are like Trinity symbols basically. And so when you land on a space, if there happens to be 3 characters on the same space at the same time, you could activate this specific ability based on that card. And so that's cool that they pulled that from the video game, as that was a big part of the actual game. But then in this game, I kind of felt like it was never used, especially in the 2-player game. You don't use it at all. But the frequency that I found all of our characters ending up on the same space was almost never. So it was a very rare occurrence, and there was a lot of those cards in the deck, and often we just kind of found ourselves throwing them to the side, never to use them. So it was kind of like they tried to add that in, but it didn't necessarily impact the game very much. But again, maybe if you're playing with more players, that might happen more frequently compared to a lower player game. But overall, I really enjoy this game. I think it's a lot of fun. It's very thematic. I think it stays true to the Kingdom Hearts theme. I think Talisman was a good game to put this in. It has some strategy, but also some randomness as well to the game. So it's different every time you play. So I think it has a high replay value, especially with all the different starting characters you can play as. That could give you a lot of different opportunities to replay the game, but have a totally different experience as you play. I think it also does a good job using the RPG elements that are found in the Kingdom Hearts games and kind of tying that into the Talisman board game. That fits very well. And I'm glad I got a chance to play this game. And so I would definitely recommend checking it out if you're a fan of Kingdom Hearts or you're looking for more a mild dungeon crawler versus like a hardcore dungeon crawler. This game is a lot of fun, and I recommend picking it up and adding it to your nerd library. But if you'd like to get a copy of the game, there'll be a link in the description below where you can pick this up. But if you like this video, be sure to smash that like button, as it really helps out the channel. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe and turn on those bell notifications to get the latest updates of new nerd videos we put out here. And if you'd like to help us support the channel, pick out content and more, become a patron of ours over at nerdproblemsgaming.com/Patreon. And if you'd like to plug into our live streams and Let's Plays we do on the channel, you can follow us on Twitch at nerdproblemsgaming.com/Twitch. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you more soon.